Top Med Talk. Good morning, everyone. We're here at Anesthesiology 2024, the annual meeting of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. You can find us on our website, topmedtalk.com, and on social, Facebook, and on YouTube. So give us a thumbs up if you see us on YouTube. And I'll just start with a thank you to the ASA for having us here, for giving us this fantastic booth that we have, and for enabling these conversations. Top Med Talk providing free, open access conversations around healthcare, and particularly perioperative healthcare, to the world. And one final thank you to our sponsors, Edwards Life Sciences, GE Healthcare and Medtronic, who enable us to provide this content free. So, I have two very special guests with me today. First of all, Jason Greenberg.
Jason Greenberg, I'm a cardiac anesthesiologist by training, was in practice for several years, leading a large independent practice, which is my passion, for many years until I transitioned over into my current role, where I serve as the Chief Client Officer of Ventra Health, a large provider of professional billing for facility-based physicians, heavily focused on anesthesia. So a lot of kind of my background in independent practice, passion for independent practice, is what I translate to our clients at Ventra Health.
And Shena Scott.
My name's Shena Scott. I live in Melbourne, Florida. I've been in anesthesia practice management and consulting for over 30 years. I started out working with a large independent anesthesia practice in Central Florida, was with them for about 20 years, and was very active nationally. I was president of the Anesthesia Administration Assembly of the Medical Group Management Association, went on to become chair of the MGMA board, and also have been very active with ASA over the years. In 2012, I led that group through a large merger with emergency medicine and radiology to form a large multi-specialty practice. And then in 2018, I left that group to form my own consulting practice, and I've been working with anesthesia groups and hospitals all around the country, primarily helping with hospital contracting, strategic planning, and governance.
Fantastic. It's great to have you both on the show.
Thanks.
So let's start to frame this conversation. Jason, do you want to talk to us a little bit about the importance of being on top of the practice finances?
Yeah, sure. It goes without saying it's incredibly important, especially for independent practices. These days, there are a ton of challenges for independent practices. We know 5 or 10 years ago in the United States that roughly 50% of practices were independent. We, as things have shifted now, the most recent data shows that about only 25% of practices have remained independent at this point. So there are clearly many market forces at this point pushing towards employment and outside of independent practice. So it is incredibly important that independent practices are great stewards of their finances. When I think about finances for independent practices, we really think about a few key things. I mean, at its most basic level, how are you maximizing revenue? How are you minimizing cost? Very simple, right? From the revenue standpoint, really two key levers and areas that independent practices have to focus on. One is how well are they being paid and reimbursed by their payers? And that's being managed through the revenue cycle partner or internally, however they're doing that. So how are we paying attention to how well these practices are pulling in the money that they well deserve? And a lot of that comes down to, and we can talk about this later, following KPIs, following the data, and really understanding their cash velocity and how well things are going. The other side of the equation is how well are they interacting and negotiating subsidies with the facilities they work with. Nowadays in anesthesia, subsidization from facilities is increasing exponentially, and that's not just on the hospital side, but also the ASC side. So practices have to pay really particular attention to that piece. The last thing I would mention is the cost side. Cost is important, especially in independent practices. How well are you hiring and recruiting your resources and your providers? What are you paying them, and how well are you utilizing them? If you're an independent practice and you're paying attention to all these things as your North Star, you're doing a good job.
Very clear. And Shena, can you talk to us a little bit about the governance side of things? What should everybody be considering there?
Sure. Well, it's really important if a practice is trying to stay independent to make sure they have a really effective governance structure, because one of the things that if they don't, then they're not going to be able to respond timely, and they're not going to be able to do things in an appropriate fashion. What we see a lot of times with small practices is that all of the physicians want to be involved in every decision, and that is a very difficult governance model to be able to respond quickly. So many times you'll see they start that way, and then they sort of move towards this benevolent dictatorship, and then everybody becomes distrustful of that person. They swing back many times, and eventually they'll usually form some kind of an executive committee or board where they're electing 3, 5, or 7 is usually what we would recommend, people that will be managing the practice and making decisions for the practice. One of the things that I think is really a challenge is sometimes it's difficult for the physicians to give up that control and really empower their leaders to do things. Many times what we'll see is even if they've empowered the leadership structure, they don't really believe it, and we see a lot of second guessing, and that makes it really difficult for the physician leaders. I will say many times I deal with a lot of great physician leaders, and they just kind of get tired out. They'll tell me that, so one of the worst things they have to deal with is their own partners. And so I think it's really important, if you're going to try to maintain your independence, that you work like a business and operate like a business. And in order to do that, you have to have a leadership structure, and it has to be empowered.
It's fascinating. I'm from the UK. I work in the UK, and we don't have this arrangement. Most doctors for most healthcare are salaried. So the burden of managing all the finances and managing all the governance seems very significant. How does that play out for smaller practices?
I think that is, as Shena said, one of the most challenging things. If you can effectively manage the medical practice well, you could almost do anything. As you know, most corporations, business in this country is a hierarchical structure, much easier to manage. Most of the medical practices that are independent in this country are very lateral, often partnership oriented, and it can be unwieldy and very difficult to manage. So governance is incredibly important, that you've got strong governance, you've got strong buy-in by all the physician partners.
I mean, I can see if you're a large group, you've got economies of scale, but a small group, that seems like there's an awful lot of effort just to manage the practice. How does that work?
There is, and it takes a lot of the physician time, and many times what you find is that the physicians who aren't doing that work don't want to compensate the physicians who are doing that work because they only value clinical care, right? And that's easy to say if that's all you do is clinical care. But if you're one of the people that is investing your time to really try to manage the practice, doing things that are really outside your wheelhouse. Most physicians don't have a business background. They don't have business training. And as a group gets a little bit larger, they can usually afford to hire a non-physician practice administrator that will be able to help with some of those things. But if they're a small enough group that the physicians are trying to do that themselves, it is a challenge. They spend a lot of evening hours and weekend hours managing those difficult aspects of managing the practice. And so it's really a kick in the face when they then turn around and have their partners challenging them or mistrusting them or questioning their decisions. And it's like, I'm doing all this on my spare time. And so I think it's really important not only to have an effective governance structure, but to support it, both financially and with administrative time, so that the people who are in group leadership are able to have a clinical day off to take care of the things that they need to be able to take care of to run the group. Because if they don't, then the group can't be managed effectively, and the only options will be what you're talking about, to go to a salaried model, whether they have to become an employee of the hospital or whether they become an employee of a much larger private equity type group or something like that. And many physicians in the U.S. are used to the idea, like Jason said, up until recently, probably 50% of physicians worked in independent practices. And many physicians like that model and want that control over their destiny, but it takes an investment.
I mean, what you sound like you're describing to me is a bunch of mini corporations with all the functions that come with them. They're in a competitive environment sort of relative to their anesthesiology peers, but also in terms of communicating a value proposition more generally. How do they go about that?
One of the biggest challenges, it's very difficult for a group of physicians to really have sometimes the perspective that it's important to be putting in a lot of time to maintain the health of the practice. Oftentimes, I mean, look, the physicians who are part of the practice, their lifeblood has been clinical medicine. They're out there, they're the anesthesiologists, they're in the operating room, that is what they're focused on. And they may not necessarily appreciate the work that's required to keep the practice going. And so I think, to answer your question, what's most important is that the leadership within the group create a culture of accountability. They create a culture that creates a vision and importance of why they need to be doing what they need to be doing administratively. Without that, that's often where I see things break apart. If the entirety of the organization doesn't understand why you need to make the tough and courageous decisions you need to make as a practice, oftentimes things can fall apart.
You'd say administratively, but you're talking about the whole business function, defining the value proposition and managing all the relevant relationships. What are those relationships and what are the skills needed there?
relationships. As a practice, you have relationships with your own practice, you have relationships with your partners in the clinical environment, and you have relationships with the hospital administration. All of those have to be kind of front and center to the way that you think about your value proposition. And they're all incredibly important, right? Your relationships with your own partners are important because your group will function in a much more efficient way. There will be built kind of inherent trust in the organization if you've got those relationships. The relationships with your co-partners in practice, the nurses, the operating room techs, also incredibly important. I'll use this example. If you're in the operating room and you've got great relationships with your operating room nurses, you've got great relationships with your techs in the room, if something happens and there's a bad outcome or there's a bad situation, the first people that are going to come and help you out and rescue you are the people you've got good relationships with. If you're starting from a place of negativity and there's a clinical situation that's problematic, you're not going to have that and you're going to have a bad outcome. The reason I say that is when we extrapolate that to overall relationships within the hospital system, the same analogy applies. When you as a small group go to hospital administration and you need to negotiate a difficult contract, have a really courageous or difficult conversation, if you're starting from a place of positivity with a good relationship, you're much more likely to get to yes on that contract. If you're starting from a place of negativity, it's much more difficult to meet people in the middle. So relationships all the way around, keep the group cohesive, keep your group in good graces in the hospital system, and set you up for success when you're negotiating those key contracts.
I would just echo that and say that because I go into a lot of different hospitals, a lot of different systems, and I will say the easiest and most successful contracts are usually the ones where the group already has a really good established relationship all the way up the ladder. Like Jason said, it starts with the operating room nurses and it goes all the way up to the C-suite. And it's important for groups to be able to really establish those relationships and nurture them because they're very important to any kind of negotiation.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when we've talked about the business side of things, how does the quality of the clinical care, the underlying product, how is that reflected in this?
I think we could all agree that quality care is incredibly important. And quality care is important for several reasons. It's important when you look at your group for just good outcomes and doing the right thing for patients. At the end of the day, that's what this is all about, right? But quality of care also has drivers for the business of your practice as well. Quality of care has effects on how well you're going to negotiate, again, those facility agreements. A quality group that goes to the facility and is well known and has had good outcomes for the hospital, has led to lower lengths of stay, however you're thinking about it, has employed programs like ERAS programs, etc. All of those things will allow you to have a conversation with administrators and they will understand your value, right? You can't also forget how that quality might extend to the payers as well. That's a piece that I think people don't always pay so much attention to. Quality of care maps to sometimes negotiating contracts that are more favorable for the groups as well. So those quality of care really hit the two drivers that are important. But I'll say this final piece. Don't rest on your quality of care laurels. I think that groups overplay this card way too much. There are a lot of great physicians out there. There's a lot of great work being done. But don't think just because you are the best anesthesia group around that you're going to be able to march into the hospital and get what you want. To me, it is table stakes for setting up a good negotiation, but it's not the end all, and it certainly won't close that deal if that's all you're relying on.
So the piece we've been talking about is critically important.
Well, and I think, unfortunately, quality is assumed to a certain degree, right? I think everybody assumes that you're going to bring good quality, and so it's important, but it becomes very important if it's a negative. That's one thing I want to be sure that we touch on because I think it's something that's challenging for physician groups is to deal if they have an outlier physician, whether it's a behavioral outlier or a clinical outlier. It's typically very difficult for them to deal with that, even if they have a good governance structure, just because I think physicians by nature are non-confrontational and they're nice people and they're autonomous and they assume that I shouldn't be telling you how to do something and you shouldn't be telling me how to do something. So if we have somebody who is really being an outlier and the group doesn't have a mechanism to deal with that, then all of a sudden the group, you're going as strong as your weakest link. And so if the group doesn't have things in place to deal with that, procedures in place and protocols in place to deal with that, then it's going to end up in the hospital, and the hospital's going to end up having to deal with it. They think the group is weak. They think the group can't manage itself, and all of a sudden, they want to employ you. So it's really a very critical part of maintaining independence is to make sure that you're effectively managing your group. Those difficult conversations are easier than what might follow if you don't have them.
Very useful. So we're coming up to the end of the time we have. Really interesting conversation. Shena, any final words for independent practices to really keep themselves competitive in this space?
Yeah, I think probably one thing I would also encourage them is to make sure that they make time for strategy. I think particularly in today's market with the workforce shortages and everybody's so busy and overworked and overtired, and it's like the last thing you want to do after you've just worked a 14-hour shift is go to a meeting and talk about strategy. And so it kind of gets pushed to the back burner and pushed to the back burner. But if you don't stay on top of that, then all of a sudden you're going to wake up one day and the world's going to change around you and you're not going to have a plan. So I would encourage groups to make time for it, do it on a Saturday morning, maybe have a nice breakfast, go somewhere not in the hospital where the walls might have ears, go to a separate place and have a meeting and really talk about your strategy, talk about your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities and threats, and what are your opportunities for the future, what's the best place to get you to where you want to be within a year, 2 years, 5 years.
Wise words. Well, listen, thank you both for your time and your perspectives. Thank you to our listeners. Thank you to the ASA for hosting us here in this wonderful booth. Look us up on our website, topmedtalk.com, and on socials and YouTube. Give us a thumbs up if you do. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back in a while. Bye-bye.
Top Med Talk. Thanks for downloading Top Med Talk. Don't forget to subscribe, check us out on YouTube, and of course on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook and X. Also, it's important to remember that Top Med Talk is the broadcasting arm of EBPOM, Evidence-Based Perioperative Medicine. We'd love you to find out more about that, and the way to do that is ebpom.org. Check out our website and find out about some of the incredible conferences we're going to be arranging across the year. ebpom.org.